So, Margaret, welcome to Lancefield on the Line. Fantastic to see you today, and delighted that your book, which I have right here, which I have read page by page, letter by letter, word by word. It's been one of the strategy and business best strategy books. It's a fantastic read. I'm not your agent, but if I was, well, I'd say, look, beautifully written, reads like a novel as much as a management book. The range of depth of case studies is fantastic and enriching. And as ever, you call out the conventional wisdom and sort of challenge us hard, particularly in the area of strategy and thinking about the future. We'll delve into that and some other themes in the next 20 minutes or so. But if I just start off with, what prompted you, if you like, now? Well, obviously you wrote a book a while ago, but what prompted you around now to actually focus on this topic? What motivated you?
Yeah. Really, what motivated me was I kept having conversations with people that I kind of didn't understand. And I think in some ways, all of my books have started with something where I didn't understand it and I didn't think the conventional wisdom explained it to me. And in this case, it was that people would come up and ask me what was going to happen, for example, in the Brexit referendum, or what was going to happen with Trump's first campaign. And I was just puzzled by it because I kept thinking, but how do they expect me to know? Nobody knows. And there are lots of reasons for, what Trump might win or might lose, lots of reasons why Brexit might win or might lose. But nobody knew. And yet there was a sort of feeling implicit in all of these questions that somebody knew.
Yes.
And it was as if the outcome was, sealed in an envelope, but a few people got to peek inside the envelope. And I kept thinking, but there is no envelope, or if there is, there's nothing inside it. And so it just got me thinking about all the different ways in which people think about the future and the way that they've done that historically. And that kind of led me down a path, which I think ultimately persuaded me that the future is fundamentally unknowable.
Yes.
And that being the case, then what I think of is the three-legged stool of management or of strategy, which is forecast, plan, execute. That wouldn't work. And that therefore we had to think about the sort of questions in business in quite a different way.
Yeah.
And I think, fundamentally, I think that what's happened is that we very subtly, most people haven't noticed it, undergone a shift, as I write in the book, from a world that was broadly based, complicated, to one that's significantly complex. And these are so radically different from each other. They feel just like a step jump, but actually they're radically different from each other.
Yes.
And if we're trying to do strategy in a complex world, thinking of it as complicated won't work.
One of the things you refer to is the sort of, if you like, the comfort, or in some cases, the laziness of relying on models, forecasters, algorithms, and actually in some ways, stopping you thinking, truly thinking you for yourself, relying on it too much. And you talk about, obviously, in that context of complexity, the need to obviously involve people in conversations in a more meaningful way, in and outside an organization, and experiment. And my reflection from reading your book and my own experiences, at one level, that's intuitive, but it doesn't happen, or doesn't happen that often. And I just wondered, in your travels, in your various different roles, what do you think gets in the way of the intuition not leading into action, if you like?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that gets in the way is a notion that somewhere there is a prescription. And if we just had it and we followed the rules, we would, create eternal wealth and glory for ourselves. And I think, this gets me into trouble, but I'll say it anyway. I think business books are part of the problem here. I mean, I think business schools are too, but the sort of, 3 steps to eternal fame and fortune, 6 dysfunctions of this and 5, success tips for that. And in some way, the overly detailed use of case studies suggests that there is a recipe out there and that clever people have it and follow it to the letter or to the KPI. And so that's what you have to have. And I think the truth is that many of these case studies, if not most of them, are written looking backwards. And they've tidied up all the dead ends and the stray kind of misadventures. And they often edit out the fact that actually we were aiming at B, and it's just when we landed at C that we decided, oh, we were going off to C all along,
Yes.
And so we've kind of perpetuated this myth that you really can think it all out and have this framework and get to your chosen destination as easily and as trouble-free as your GPS will get you, to your nearest post office.
Yes.
And I think of this in some ways in the field of strategy management. I think of it sort of, I think of it as both misleading, but also as a kind of palliative, because it does mean that we don't have to think about it. We just have to look for the sort of magic recipe. And I think it's given people, I think it's taken away a lot of people's courage or imagination to try stuff. And it's made them feel that they can't really be decisive if they don't have all the information and a complete plan. And that's made them very rigid. It's made them very reluctant to set off on a journey where they haven't mapped every single pit stop. And it's given us an idea of leadership, which is this kind of omniscient guide. And I think, I think it may well be that once upon a time that worked, but it definitely doesn't work now.
No.
And I'm not a sufficiently good historian to know how far it ever worked, but I am sufficiently embroiled in the business world to know now that it doesn't.
Yes. Yes, it's quite, I see a lot of organizations search for the insert name of tech company strategy equivalent for their own organization.
Yeah.
And then do lots of analysis, and consultants are guilty of it, including, no doubt I have been at some point in my career. And I guess because it requires a different mindset and a skill to ask questions, listen attentively to others. And it's interesting, I've just been reading Nancy Klein's new book, which and I know Nancy well, and I know you've put a quote in where you actually have to listen, and I'm trying to do this on this call, which is listen without interruption, and actually be comfortable with genuine ambiguity, not just about the trends and the future, but about the path for the organization. And the reason I mention that is that's a pretty big change of skill and mindset for many leaders embroiled in strategy. And the simple question I'd ask, and I say that with a wry smile, is where do we start in changing that mindset and that skill set?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. I mean, I think to some degree, we've started. We didn't expect to start this way. But I think since everybody's strategy has just been upended by the pandemic, and since at least right now, it's pretty obvious that these beautiful plans are a fantasy for the next 6 months, 18 months, I think in a way we've found that we've been thrown into it, whether we wanted it or not.
Yes.
And my observation is I work with a very broad range of companies, from very entrepreneurial startups to global gigantic corporations. And my observation, talking to people in all of those different companies, countries, sectors, sizes, is that they roughly have they have responded to this crisis in one of two ways. A whole bunch of them quickly moved to working from home, remote working, all that stuff. And then they heaved a big sigh of relief and thought, phew, that's fine. We've got the car back on the road. Now we just kind of drive a little gently.
Yes.
And then there's another group that also got the remote working sorted pretty quickly and then thought, oh, right, now this is really different. This is not where we expect it to be. So what we need to do now is a really big rethink. Where are we? What have we got? What are our assets? What are our resources? And how do we reconfigure those for this new environment? And my sense is that the first group is a little sad and demotivated because they're hankering to return to normal, which isn't there. It's not available. It's not on the menu. And the second group is really invigorated because they can see in this new environment all kinds of opportunities, which maybe were there before, but it didn't feel like, you know, they were possible or allowed or permitted or whatever. And the second group, I think, has a much higher tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity. And I honestly don't know, have they just got that or did they always have it? But they're very imaginative in their thinking about the future, in the sense that the first group is really quite rigid and sometimes really frozen.
And of the second group, how, from what you're observing and advising on, how are they going about that, if at all, differently? Because one thing I was struck, the reason I asked that is one thing I was struck with in your book was you talked about a degree of, if you like, messiness, and you referred to it earlier in the conversation, and a degree of wandering. And I loved your examples in the arts and science. I've worked with a range of organizations in different fields. I've seen relatively little of that and more ex post description of it than I experienced at the time.
Yes.
So how are they going about it differently in this new environment?
Quite a lot of them are. I mean, they're certainly listening, to go back to your original question. They're listening very hard. They're actively convening groups of partners, suppliers, customers to get a sense of what does the world look like for them. I mean, very interesting, just, you know, two quick examples, you know, John Lewis Partnership, which was already having a big strategic rethink because of the bloodbath that is retail. You know, when we had lockdown in the UK, they had people going into Waitrose stores, volunteering to work for free just to keep the business going. And they suddenly saw what they meant to their customers in a way that they'd never really understood before, which has led to all kinds of questions about, okay, so if that's the relationship we have, that's a tremendous asset. And as we're trying to figure out how to reposition the business, what really speaks to that? How do we bring those people with us? So that's a very different kind of conversation than they traditionally have had, which tended, for all that it's employee owned, to be very, very top down.
Yes.
There's another organization I've worked with, which used to be, if you like, a kind of rather conventional, traditional collecting society for royalties for visual artists, which now that visual artists are in deep, deep, deep trouble, right? Because, you know, exhibitions have been canceled, galleries are closed, all the part-time teaching jobs have mostly vanished, all the artists who invigilated at museums don't have jobs anymore. I mean, this is a catastrophe. They've started thinking, okay, actually, you know, a collecting society was there to distribute earnings to artists. But actually, there's a lot we could do using technology to boost the economic potential of artists and find better ways for artists to be remunerated for their work. So this is a whole new ball game, right? This is both new technology products, new services.
Yes.
It's looking at legislative changes. I mean, it's got a whole new head of steam in terms of it's about time that we didn't let happen to visual artists what happened to musicians when the internet came along. And actually, we think we know how to do this. And this is actually what we now need to do. And that really derived directly from convening lots of meetings with lots of visual artists in all sorts of different fields to say, actually, what is your life like? What is your working life like? And where do we see the opportunity of being decently remunerated for all the different ways that you pursue your profession?
They're brilliant examples. The second one, I think, sounds like we've got something in common, because I've worked with that organisation in the past as well, and it's got a great cause, and I believe in it at a personal level as well as professional. Both clarity on the, say, the relationships with John Lewis, and I guess the, use management speak, capabilities, or the resources that they have and how they can deploy it. And that convening, you talk about that in the book quite a lot, about how to convene different groups. I mean, brilliant examples. And I'm not going to give the game away. People have to read the book, of course. In Mexico and in Texas and other examples, where I guess these are, you genuinely have to have real diversity of people involved, right? And not just for lip service, but genuine diversity, who will speak and think and talk and interact in many different ways that are not as easy to manage, and in some ways you can't manage right. them. But I guess you have to also make sure that the questions that are being asked are simple enough that can be understood and worked on. That again, I don't dismiss the argument. I completely buy into it. You stand back from it and you think, well, of course you're going to invite lots of ideas into a process, and then you act on it. But as you said, a lot of companies, not just the large ones, have been very much either founder businesses, founder entrepreneurs sort of businesses, all the way up to the large corporates, have been, yes, we believe in that engagement once we've cooked up the idea ourselves, produced a large document. And by the way, we're just about to finish it, but we'd love your unbridled views on how we should change it. And by the way, you've got 2 days to go. I caricature it. Or
it's done, by kind of rather lame surveys, which don't really encourage participation. I mean, I think some of the convening which I saw, it's really stuck in my mind because it was so effective, not just in getting all voices heard, but in making sure that all voices had kind of equal status. Because one of the things that goes awry when more formal organizations try to do this is that power becomes very disruptive. And you get a situation where people try to say what they think the boss wants to hear, or they try to say what they think is acceptable, or not to say what is unacceptable. And so I think it takes genuine skill to convene a discussion where everything can be said and taken seriously and taken on an equal basis. And I think, the very long scenario planning exercise that I watched in Mexico, one of the things that was so striking about this was the diversity of participants was exorbitant, right? So you have police chiefs and terrorists, you have archbishops, and you have indigenous women. I mean, it was really extraordinary. So the difficulty of that is, how do you make sure that these people of wildly different social status have equal status in the room?
Yes.
And the way that they did that was by saying, we're going to ask questions and anybody can speak who wishes to, but nobody can speak for more than 1 minute. Now, this is profoundly leveling. I mean, for one thing, it means people really have to know what they want to say. But for an archbishop to have the same length of time as an indigenous woman who works as a cleaner really says something.
Yes.
And I think, I'm not just saying this because I think it's a cool idea. I'm saying it because I was able to witness how profoundly it changed the perspectives of everybody in the room. And especially because for the most part, everybody was talking about lived experience, in which, of course, they are their own experts, rather than just kind of theoretical guff.
Yes.
And so, and of course, if you're speaking for a minute, nobody can interrupt you, to go back to Nancy Klein, right? And a minute turns out to be a time in which you can say quite a lot. Yes. But this was a very dedicated attempt to ensure that all voices were heard. And increasingly, I guess, I think that one of the jobs of the people who think of themselves as leaders must be to convene groups of people where this kind of dialogue can occur, but it's also to ask the most pertinent questions.
Yes. It's
not to be the person who comes in with the answer.
Indeed. It's sort of, as Nancy would say, that, you know, it's about treating the listener kindly in that 1 minute.
And I would say treating the listener with respect.
Respect, yes.
And I think about this particularly because, you know, in the tech companies that I ran, it was routinely the case that some of our hardest problems were solved by the most junior people. So again, this is where power becomes a problem, which is you have to work very, very hard to ensure that those junior people will speak up, and they will speak up as they see things, and they will be heard. And I think, you know, I mean, I like to think I've learned a lot in my life, but I think one of the big things I've learned is that having power in an organization, which everybody thinks is so fabulous, right? It's the ultimate goal. It's a real problem, and it suppresses huge amounts of creativity. It suppresses huge amounts of really necessary debate and argument. And so wise leaders recognize that the power they have is a blessing and a curse. And it's why I was doing a conference last week. I was speaking at the Drucker Forum, and one of the other people there was Gian Piero Petrolieri, who said a really beautiful thing, I thought. He said, leaders are tormented, and they should be tormented, because otherwise they will become tormentors. And I think that from my own experience, I would say it's absolutely right. It's absolutely right. You are tormented by the challenge of how do I get into it on the table where we can all see it and work with it, the best contents of people's minds. And it's always hard.
And it's quite a change in, I think, as well as the skill of doing it, as you describe, the mindset of actually as the leader, even if, you know, a senior leader, actually somebody else from a different background who has not got the same level of experience, skill, might actually have a better idea. And actually say my focus is tapping into that individual or collective intelligence. And actually as a sort of, yes, an enabler, facilitator, curator, if you like. And actually that is an incredibly powerful skill to have, even though it's not as, if you like, excuse my crude language, in your face as much. You know, but that's a big shift. And going back to your point about, if you like, conflict and dissent, actually feeling comfortable and sometimes encouraging dissent, so you don't too quickly go into the groupthink. But being comfortable, and you've talked and written about this a lot, you know, feeling comfortable with conflict. And I've seen some leaders actually say at the beginning of some sessions, actually, let's have a proper debate. Let's have some disagreement if we want to. And even those few sentences can have a material shift on how people think and feel. And you can actually feel some of the shoulders drop, and then people actually leading forward.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I think, you know, one of the advantages I had when I was running tech companies was that I'm not an engineer, and I can't write code. So I mean, it doesn't sound like an advantage, right? But it does mean that you can't escape the knowledge that you can't possibly know all the answers, right? Because there's this huge part of the business whose workings you don't fully comprehend. I think the other thing is that I was also quite lucky that I quite often took people from one business to another, and they were people who were prepared to argue with me. And it was really seeing them argue with me that would tell newcomers, if you like, this is okay. When Margaret says she wants to hear some different opinions, she really means it. It's not just, you know, piffle. Because I think because I've so frequently had the experience where I've said, well, I think maybe we should do X. And then someone else says, yeah, but what about Y? And then we have a bit of an argument. And somehow this more magical thing called Z emerges, which neither of us could have created alone, but which both of us think is definitely better than where we started.
Yes, yes.
And I see it time and time and time again. And I guess, you know, if I think back to the beginning of my career when I was a radio producer, you know, you would see this in terms of, if you know, I did a lot of radio drama. You would see a play turn into something that you hadn't seen at the beginning because of the contributions of everybody in it.
Yes.
And it would be a process of discovery rather than rehearsal.
Yes,
really.
yes, yes, yes.
And I think that's what I've always aimed for, which is something better than any of us could imagine on our own, right? So we all come with ideas, of course. We're not blank pieces of paper. But then the best idea always wins, right? And it shouldn't matter where it comes from. It shouldn't matter whether it comes from, you know, the most junior person or the most senior person. If it's the best idea, let's take it.
It does beg the question, or begs a number of questions, but it begs a question for me about how and where do you start that belief system in terms of respect for other people, intriguing in their ideas and so forth. I mean, I've seen many very talented and respectful people in some contexts when they've interacted with people who are not in their executive team or consultants and so on. The security guard at the front desk, the cleaner. My grandmother was a cleaner from a council estate. It's quite revealing how actually they interact. And I'm not a psychologist and I don't pretend to have the answer on a specific case, but I find it pretty hard for some people once they get to a certain level to suddenly just, switch oh yes, of course I should invite participation, debate, and so on. It's where do you start from in the beginning? And maybe it's schools, maybe it's all the way through the education system. But I do believe passionately that something has to change for the reasons you set out beautifully in the book, where, you know, the top-down, elitist, narrow, false determinism that we see doesn't work in a world of complexity.
No, I mean, I think that's right. And I'm interested by what you say about, you know, the security guard or whatever. You know, when I used to, sometimes when I was making an important hire, take, you know, a preferred candidate out for lunch. And it really had nothing to do with lunch per se. I wanted to see how they treated the wait staff.
Right.
And if they did this thing, which I've seen over and over again, which is they're being served and they don't say thank you. And their stuff is taken away, you know, their empty plate is taken away and they don't say thank you. I just don't, this person is not going to work for me.
Quite.
You know, if they can't see that everybody here matters, that everybody here is contributing to this thing, then they're not going to get the best out of people. And they're a bit too busy thinking about themselves and not thinking about others, which is not just a moral thing. It's also thinking, but the others might have the answer, right?
Quite.
So don't waste them. And if you don't want to waste them, then you have to pay attention to them and take them seriously. And I think, you know, we've heard, and certainly I've read a lot around, you know, this people's belief in collaboration and hive minds and all this sort of stuff. I see much more lip service paid to it than real emphasis on how do you develop the skills to do it.
Yes.
And I guess most of all, and this is, you know, one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, most of all, what I've seen is a failure to understand why are we doing things this way. Now, I mean, I remember talking along similar lines at a meeting of CEOs in India, and one of them stood up and said, but, you know, Margaret, are you a communist, you know, with all this belief in collaboration? And I think, you know, that what the sort of missing piece is that in a complex environment, nobody can see the whole system. Everybody sees bits of it. And actually, if you don't get the maximum contribution from everybody, you don't have a chance. I mean, even getting everybody's perspective, there's going to be stuff you can't see, but it's your best chance really to get a grip on the ecosystem in which you're living.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So it's, you know, it's not a fad, and it's not just because some of us don't like command and control. It's because command and control and so-called scientific management and all that, you know, forecast, plan, execute stuff, which was probably okay in its day, is now, I think, an anachronism. And what disturbs me is seeing 20th century management being deployed in the 21st century. And people saying, well, how come it's so hard now? How come it doesn't work anymore? Well, it doesn't work anymore because it's like you're trying to ride your horse to New York, right?
But even perhaps even worse, that the 20th century management is being presented and portrayed as that leadership in town halls, in calls, in one-to-ones. So it gives the promise, but actually the delivery is, you know, too much. So that word empowerment, for example, which I've seen so many times, I've seen so many leaders use the term, and literally I was shadowing one individual, CEO of a large organization, shadowing and advising, use the word empowerment, and I actually came across incredibly well in this large scale event. And then within minutes of coming off the stage, did the utterly opposite of that term in terms of how he micromanaged an individual. And so my sense is that even with the best intention, there is candidly a skills gap. Some people are struggling to feel, because you've grown up in that 20th century mindset and practice.
Yeah.
If you recognize and experience the complex world, it's sort of, you'd have to be a brave person if you've grown up and you've been successful in that old world to say, you know what, hands up, I need some help, wherever that help comes from.
Yeah. But on the other hand, you know, if I landed tomorrow in Slovenia where I don't know anybody and I don't speak the language, it wouldn't occur to me to start ordering people around, right? Right. We are in a new country now, and it works differently.
Yes.
And the old stuff isn't all of it irrelevant, but it's not going to be good enough. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about this is, you know, we saw the World Economic Forum perpetrating this concept of the fourth industrial revolution, which was really just a tech revolution, another one, right? And, you know, the more I think about that, the more I think, wow, you missed the story. That's not it. That's part of it. It may be a manifestation of it. It's both, I mean, as is often the case in complex systems, it's both cause and effect. But it's only one driver of where we are. It is not the defining characteristic of the age. You missed the story.
Yeah, that's really well made.
And it is not digital transformation that is doing people's heads in.
Can I ask, I'm thinking and reflecting, but I want to go down a slightly lateral point. The one thing I said at the beginning, and you've referred to, is the range and depth and the just vibrancy of the stories you tell in this book and others. It's just, I think, very distinctive. If I have to read another management book that always refers to the same examples, I'm going to I won't buy it, let alone read it.
I know.
So this is a different angle, and I'm curious, if not a little bit nosy. Where do you go for these? I'm not looking for research assistants. I'm just saying, where do you, your mindset yourself when you're doing your own exploring yourself to come up with? Tell me a little bit about that. If I may ask that.
Well, it's interesting. It's definitely not the research assistant. I mean, I sometimes do have research assistants, but that's, you know, to find out detail rather than stories. I mean, I do wonder, you know, I work in a very weird, collection of companies. I read a lot of things. I mean, I almost never read business books. I talk to lots of people. I like to think I kind of collect weird and interesting people. I'm very curious. And I think I'm pretty open-minded in the sense that I start off with the belief that anybody I meet is interesting. And it's my job to find out in what way are they interesting.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I do sometimes take this to ridiculous lengths. I remember at a party spending about 2 hours essentially interviewing a guy about his business, which was parts for vintage cars. And, you know, in the end, after 2 hours, I didn't think it was that interesting.
Right.
So everything isn't equally interesting. But I do basically start from the perspective that whoever you are and whatever you do, that you are interesting. Yeah, and so one thing leads to another. And so people say, oh, you should go and talk to so-and-so. You should go and talk to so-and-so. And so I follow my nose. And it's fair to say I go down quite a lot of dead ends.
Right?
But you can't not, right? And every now and then you just hit pay dirt. You just meet someone and you think, oh my God, this is exactly what I needed to know. Or this is exactly the sort of setting that I want to explore. So, you know, for example, the long thing in there about the new healthcare system in Austin, Texas.
Yes.
It came about because one of the doctors working there is the father of my son's oldest friend.
Right.
Now, I don't know him very well. And he was never particularly friendly to me. But my son said, well, you know, he's leaving Harvard to go to Texas. I said, well, that's weird, right? How come? And he said, well, they're trying to do something new. You know, that's the lead. That's the only lead.
Yes.
Is my son's best friend's dad is moving to Texas. So why?
Yeah, that's brilliant.
You know, if you're a professor at Harvard Medical School and you work in Mass General Hospital, which is one of the best hospitals in the world, why are you going to Texas? There's got to be something interesting going on. So it's a lot of that kind of thing. And as I say, you know, a lot of dead ends.
Yeah, I guess that's to be expected. And you've got to be, I guess you've got to be comfortable with that rather than beating yourself up. Because I know a lot of people would be so determined. Like, I want to be really, really creative and imaginative and so on, but I'm so structured in how I do it that it has to get to this outcome. You're never going to do it. But
and it doesn't work.
Yeah, when you meet people, I remember somebody saying to me, if you ask somebody, you know, what do you do for a job, you'll get an answer. If you just, and you're meeting them perhaps for the first time, if you say to them, you know, what are you up to? What are you keeping you busy? I mean, what's keeping you busy? It could have a whole range of things, and the beliefs could be professional, could be personal, could be, you know, a whole range of things, but it comes from that belief system of there is something, I don't care what there is something somewhere potentially. It may not be in the first conversation, and actually may not, but some of my interest, for example, in leadership, has more come from my study of neurology, given my son has sadly brain damage. And so I spent a lot of time with doctors in Great Ormond Street and so on. And it's not all applicable. But some of my leaps in my professional understanding of leaders and psychology have come from a completely different field. Now, not something I'm going to drop into conversation all the time, although I just have unprepared. Yeah. But the willingness to sort of take pieces of your life and then sort of bring them together in some shape or form, I think is often missing where either people don't feel comfortable in a professional setting sharing something that is relevant, or thinking actually you have different lives. I remember somebody, actually my own team, who, and this is bad of me, right, where she was an expert mountain climber. I mean, truly inspiring stories. And she came at a team meeting to share how she literally went from nearly dying on the side of a mountain to scaling the summit. That's a crude description of it. And nobody had any clue whatsoever. And she was amazing at it. And that's what we need to try and get to in terms of creating that psychological safety where people can do it. I'm conscious of time. You've been very generous with your time, Margaret. It's a wonderful read. You're a clearly brilliant person. I've learned a lot in this conversation and loved your spirit throughout. So I'm very grateful for that, Margaret. Yeah, thank you.
I love your questions. I mean, questions are the start of everything, right?
Indeed, indeed.